Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PASIC, and I'm the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum here, and I'm also your moderator for this afternoon's broadcast. Our webinar, this is our third and final webinar, Emerging Risks webinar of the year. And today we're looking at the issue of climate change. And I'm joined by Dr. Janis Sarra, a distinguished academic from the field of law. So welcome, Janis. And I'll introduce Janis more formally in a moment. I'm just going to go over some housekeeping issues, and then we're going to delve into a prolonged discussion on climate change. We're filming on location in our Toronto offices. We're coming to you live, and so you may hear phones, you may hear doors opening and closing, but that is live broadcast, and I think you'll find it enjoyable. We use these webinars to drill deeply into topical issues of concern to risk managers right across the industry. And by doing our webinars and forum meetings, with the webinars, we're able to connect people across Canada who are unable to attend the 3 forum meetings that we have per year. So this is our third and final webinar. Interest in the webinar series is growing. This is our 6th full year of operation. And today's topic, climate change, is definitely an issue for risk managers and also everyday citizens. You're seeing that in newspapers more and more, and media and social media. We have reps from close to 40 organizations joining us here today from right across Canada. Welcome, everybody, and if this is your first time joining us for a webinar, welcome, and thanks for participating. I'd like to tell people this is the #1 talk show in Canada's property and casualty insurance industry, dealing with emerging risks, issues of interest to senior risk professionals, and I think we're the only talk show doing that in Canada, so maybe that's why we're #1. Antitrust compliance I have to talk about. We're a very competitive industry. We're governed by the Competition Act, so I can tell you that there are going to be no discussions about business strategies, claims adjusting practices, scopes of coverage, resolution of mixed claims, management of third-party vendors. Everyone's on best behavior here, so no concerns there. The webinar recording, we broadcast live, and we also record the webinars for future on-demand rebroadcast. You're going to find those available on our website, and a copy of today's broadcast will be available shortly. And this is good for members who are not able to join us here today. This topic today, climate change, is of tremendous tremendous interest to the industry. A large number of residents is evidence of that. We examined this issue last year in February of 2018. Paul Kovacs, the Executive Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, was in, and we talked about climate change at that time. And with Janis here today, we're going to get a fresh perspective, different insight from the field of law on this topic. We use these emerging risks webinars to focus on building blocks of a good ERM program. And we will continue to touch on topics like this as long as they remain a threat to members and of interest to the industry. So I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Janis Sarra is Presidential Distinguished Professor at the University of British Columbia. She's also the Professor of Law at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Previously, she was Director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC. And the mandate there is to foster collaborative research and make innovative contributions to the sciences, humanities, and arts, both nationally and internationally. Janis was, up until 2007, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Law and a founding director of the National Center for Business Law. Teaching and research interests Janis has very broad. She talks to us, or she has quite a background in insolvency, banking and finance, corporate governance, corporate and securities law, climate and conservation, and economics and contract law. So I don't think there's a question that you've given us that Janis will not be able to answer. She's also very widely published. She has several books, books and publications cited with approval in more than 100 superior and appellate court judgments. Very interesting that you're being cited with approval. That's always a good thing for a lawyer. And also that includes cases at the Supreme Court of Canada. Janis is an advisor with the Canadian delegation of the UN Commission on International Trade Law, the Working Group 5 dealing with insolvency law. She was called to the Bar of Ontario and has served as a commercial arbitrator, a labor mediator arbitrator, and also a tribunal vice chair. She is a director of our sister organization in the industry dealing with life issues, the Life Guarantee Fund Assurus, and also she's a director of the BC Law Institute. So welcome, Janis. Thanks for joining us here today talking about climate change. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions in advance. Again, I don't think you're going to stump Janis with some of the questions, but we were talking informally earlier, and she said she was very impressed with the quality of the questions and also the breadth. So well done, thank you very much, and we'll get to those in turn. And I guess I just want to open by saying it's interesting you're coming to us as a former dean of a faculty of law, and you're talking to us about climate change. So a lot of people are going to kind of scratch their head about that. How did you ever get into climate change amongst all of your other interests?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope it's the first of many. When I was director of the Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, which, as you said, brought together scientists, political scientists, policymakers, etc., there were a number of people working on climate change up in the Arctic North, in the oceans, in the forests, etc. And I was putting together clusters of different disciplines, and it hit me that there was not law in the conversation. And this is about 6 years ago. And so I decided, being a mother and a grandmother, that really I had to dedicate some of my time. And my interest has been, of course, financial markets and effective corporate governance. So that's really the transition, and I've slowly moved into it more and more.
Great. So one of the very first question, I told Janis about this. This is our ERM benchmark survey report, which members participated in over the summer months. We do an annual survey of members talking about risk issues, and this was published in September. It's available on our website. And one of the questions we ask, I think there's 31 questions we ask. The very final two questions are, what are risk issues that you're concerned about in the next 3 years, and what are risk issues as an industry we could be concerned about in the next 10 years? So I haven't shared this with Janis, but our very first question, I'll come back to this because it relates to this question. In your opinion, what are the top 3 risk issues and concerns that insurers should be worried about in the next 5 to 10 years as a result of climate change? And then we'll talk about what members.
So thank you for that question. I would say it's hard to keep it to 3. And maybe just by way of introduction to say a couple of things. And then these are studies you're probably very much aware of, but PwC in 2017 basically did a major report, survey of insurance companies globally. And it reported that anthropogenic climate change, so that's climate change caused by our human activities, is the biggest long-term risk for insurers globally. And that's partly the rise of all of the catastrophic events. They called it an existential threat to society. And that kind of finding was echoed by the Ontario Court of Appeal in a judgment earlier this year that is now pending in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that there was a very significant report out by what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or I will say IPCC for short. It's a group of over 800 scientists representing almost 200 countries globally, representing their countries at the United Nations, and it is considered the definitive scientific body on the changes. And I think they've been reporting for many years, but the most significant report came out late last year. And that basically says 2 really important things. The first is that we've already hit 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So we've hit it much faster than we thought. And then I think disturbing news for everyone is that they're predicting that we could be hitting 1.5 degrees as soon as 10 years from now, anywhere from 10 to 20 years from now. What that means is that we're warming at a faster rate than anybody really anticipated, and notwithstanding global commitments to try and control these issues, we're a long ways off collectively and also in Canada. So in terms of the top risks, I think I divide them sort of as insurers, and then really as companies, and then as investors, life insurance, P&C companies as insurers. As insurers, of course, the liabilities are for climate and weather-related events, and those can, because they're unpredictable, they're what everyone calls nonlinear. They can provide real shocks to the market, and that can cause unforeseen large payouts, and I think that's a fairly high risk. The other thing is that, of course, if they're nonlinear, then annual contract repricing becomes very difficult because it doesn't really take into account easily the sort of huge dips and valleys. And that, I think, uncertainty in pricing in turn, I think has implications for elasticity of the market in terms of customer satisfaction, and in terms of whether or not some premiums will just become simply unaffordable for people, which creates another whole layer of insurance risk, both for the industry and for individuals. The other thing that we're seeing a lot in the United States, and it hasn't hit Canada yet, but I think it's likely, and that is that the catastrophic events are coming one after another too fast. And so they've barely recovered from the first one. They haven't, of course, regained the value because the insurance likely does not cover anything. And so this another catastrophic event means that they may not even have replaced their insurance because they're so busy coping. And so that creates not only issues for the insured, but also for predictability about the market for P&C insurance companies. So it's sort of a feedback loop, we would call it. The other thing, of course, is that some properties, we think of low-lying coast and riverbed properties, may become completely uninsurable. And that raises all sorts of issues about how one deals with that, both from a policy perspective, but also an industry perspective. And of course, as the severity and the frequency increases, the cost of reinsurance is going to increase for all companies. And I think for smaller insurers, this could become prohibitive at some point, and that is a problem. Climate change is systemic risk. I mean, what I mean by that is it's interactive, it feeds on events, it feeds on weather and climate changes, but it means that also companies can't really diversify away from it, and so we all really have to address it, and I think that's why it's become so important. As a company, just looking at it from a company perspective, of course, acute events can actually result in disruption to insurance companies, everything from their buildings to their effects on their employees. We've seen extreme heat spells that lead to different issues for morbidity or health issues for older or mid-age employees or employees with asthma, etc. And then as large investors, or maybe not so large investors, I think there's an impact on real assets that are exposed to these weather-related perils. So a good example is a lot of insurance companies are quite invested in real estate. And there are all sorts of challenges around retrofitting buildings, around their vulnerability to storm surges, to sewage surges, to all sorts of flooding in terms of real risk to the assets. I think there is a risk to assets from what we call stranded assets. So in other words, companies that are heavily invested in the carbon-intensive industries, fossil fuel industries, for example, that there is a risk of some stranded assets as the Canadian economy moves. We're seeing this in lots of places in the world. And then I think there's an impact on the economic viability of both insurance and reinsurance companies when we haven't sort of adapted the pricing mechanisms and the pricing models, I guess, to be really taking into account climate change.
Do you find it frustrating that we're still arguing about whether or not there is a threat of climate change? Do you find it it's concerning that there's a whole element out there, the whole subculture that just doesn't buy it, the Flat Earth Society in 2019? I think
they're truly a minority now. I mean, if you'd asked me this question 6 years ago, I would have said there's a sizable community. It was very interesting that I had to actually do some research, believe it or not, on what's happening with sort of evangelical churches in the United States, which people have this perception as they're climate deniers. And in fact, over 6,000 churches in the US have gone to Congress to say we need a new Green Deal that deals with climate change. So it's sort of an interesting fact that I learned recently is this idea that all sorts of movements have popped up in the last 3 years. And it's a very small minority that would say this is not a serious issue. Even where we had dissents at the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan in respect of whether we should have a national carbon pricing law, the denial, there was no issue around how serious it is as an issue. There was only a question of whether it should be provincial authority or federal authority.
It's almost like on a countrywide basis, it's like a poker game. Everybody is just looking for somebody to make the first move. And when you hear of countries, India, China, where you open the drapes and you think it's still dark outside, but it's actually daylight and there's so much smog, it's frustrating here when we're hit with a carbon tax and people say, what are we doing? Like, is it really having an impact globally? But there has to be first steps, obviously.
It's part of addressing systemic risk. Mm-hmm. No one country can do it. But if everybody waits for another first mover, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. We'll be in trouble in my lifetime, let alone my children and my grandchildren. And I do think countries like China are genuinely trying to make an effort. I think people are a bit discouraged by the US politics because they're the highest emitting country globally. They have benefited for many, many years economically, as we have, from activities. I'm always fond of saying, let's not make any mistake. We have been the beneficiaries economically of the oil and gas sector in this country. We need it for our transportation. We're a cold country. We like to be heated. Many, 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 many benefits. So the question is transition and how you do that. But I think by my obscure reference to some things going on in the US is basically what you find is that people are acting in spite of the government. Currently there are, we'll talk about litigation later, but currently there are 20 lawsuits by state attorney generals against what we call carbon majors.
Wow.
And they basically are litigating to say you need to pay your fair share of us having to bolster our shorelines, California, Rhode Island, all of the coastal ones, New York. And I think that's an action to say, well, if the government's not going to act, we're going to act.
Interesting. You mentioned some of the actions we can take to mitigate climate change. I'll talk about that later on with questions, but you should know we share the office here with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and their website is iclr.org, and there's lots of great ideas there about risk mitigation for insurance companies. And if you haven't been on the site, then I certainly encourage you to do that. Put a plug in here for my colleagues in the office. Second question, have you seen an increase in wildfires due to climate change? So Janis and I were talking earlier about the situation in Fort McMurray, the fact that I can't believe the number of my friends that know all about Fort Mac. I thought it was kind of an insurance company issue or an industry issue in their minds, but it's been so widely reported that it really is, it's filtering down, and people do get it now more and more. Maybe, like you say, more than 5 or 6 years ago, the level of concern and interest. So do you see an incidence? Is people love to build close to forests? They surround themselves. They love to be in touch with nature. Are we too close? Are we building too much, too close? What's your reaction to that?
Well, my sense certainly is, living in British Columbia, that it is, and I can speak about that in a second. But I will say that scientifically, there's no doubt. Again, the IPCC is tracking this very carefully. It's being done by satellite technology. Natural Resources Canada tracks wildfires in Canada. Fort McMurray, of course, burned 6,000 square kilometers of land area. 80,000 people were lost their homes, businesses, etc. So fairly catastrophic loss. Our production was disrupted. Everything was disrupted. Now, we were very lucky. We didn't have any direct fatalities. There were some indirect fatalities from breathing, etc. But just to give you an example of another wildfire not that far down from where we are in California, the Camp Fire killed 85 people. Wow. And it destroyed 19,000 buildings. And there are currently $30 billion US in insurance claims for that one fire, or one and a related fire. And I went online just to see what this year's been, because it seems to have been what they call slightly quieter. But even then, in the first 7 months of 2019, there were over 200 wildfires burning in August of this year. And of those, over 154 or 7 were burning uncontrollably. And I say this personally. I live in British Columbia. I live in a small island offshore. But when the wildfires are really bad, my little community, even though they have to cross at least the strait, the sky turns orange, and it's very hard to breathe, and I can't breathe without a puffer, and I'm miles and miles and miles and miles away from any fires. So it is really increasing. And then just that's sort of wildfires. The stats from the government are that on average in Canada the past decade, wildfires have burned 2.5 million hectares a year. So that's half the size of Nova Scotia each year for the last decade. Wow. Did you want me to talk about flooding too?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I have a question about winter issue, but absolutely,
okay.
please.
Well, flooding I think is really important. It's as important as wildfires, if not more important. As you all probably know, the Insurance Bureau of Canada has said that basically flooding has increased in all of the categories of what they call their categories: flash floods, coastal floods, riverine floods. And it's a combination of the warming temperatures in the ocean, so more rainfall, storm surges, overstepping coastal defenses, rising sea levels. All of those things are causing major economic losses to many communities. And what I found really interesting was that the IBC reports that water damage claims are now the #1 property claim in Canada, even though many standard health insurance policies don't cover floods. It's still the #1 claim now. And of course, we've seen it in many cities, Calgary, Toronto, the Gaspé. I recently saw an image of the Gaspé where a bunch of cars were totally knocked together and completely submerged underwater. It was a very powerful image. And the IPCC, again, to just give you some broader stats, says that North Atlantic hurricanes are now one of the 4 highest catastrophe risks globally. So the intensity of what we're going to see in hurricanes is going to definitely go up. And we saw this, of course, just last month with Hurricane Dorian. There were 65-foot waves. People lost their hydro.
That's hard to imagine, 65-foot wave as well.
And, 450,000 households lost their power. And, of course, one of the things that you don't really think about, but with flooding, and, of course, where electricals are in first floors or in basements, it becomes an incredible health and safety hazard for children and families in terms of risk of being electrocuted. But I think the big thing is that the damage is huge. I don't think the numbers are in for Dorian yet to give us a sense of what the insurance claims are. It's too recent. But I can tell you that Hurricane Sandy, which wasn't that long ago, in New York City had damage of $19 billion in insurable damage, one event. So when you put all that together, I think flooding has become something that probably someone like me hadn't really thought about 10 years ago. And it's a really urgent issue now to be addressed, I think.
It gets so widely reported on the news now in Toronto. We've had the number of underpasses that flood. It's almost a common occurrence now. Becomes such a big issue, and it wasn't like this 10 years ago. I know we're paving over everywhere, it seems, downtown, but now it's almost expected. People are, what I have to go out in the car, and what underpass do I have to avoid because I know that section of the city is going to be flooded. It's crazy that it's happening like this. Janis and I were talking earlier. Janis used to live on Toronto Island, and I think her daughter's still there, and they had the presence of mind years ago to rebuild the house and put all the electricals well off the ground up in the roof you were talking about. And we had flooding in Toronto Island. That's almost become expected now year after year. That's, I think, 2 out of the last 3 years. It's become an issue. So I don't know are you seeing it skewed more summertime, winter? Because our second question was, do you believe that the severity of winter storms is increasing as well? Is there good news for Canada? We only have to worry about the summer, or are winters equally as bad? We had the ice storm years and years ago, but is that on par? It's
a good question. I would say that this is not an even trajectory. I think that's one of the real challenges for the P&C insurance sector. You can say this is not a linear progression. So I think we are going to still have very severe storms. Whether it's a linear, yes, it's an increase. I don't think that I really know that, and I'm not sure anybody does. But having said that, there's no question that the severity of all of these acute events is getting worse, and that there's a broad consensus on that. So if it's massive storms from a tropical storm that turns into a hurricane, there's sort of definitions of when it turns from one to the other. Right. It's much more severe and much more frequent. And I would say the same thing for ice storms. If we happen to hit a cold spell, a cold front comes up, it turns what it could be a rainstorm into quite a severe winter storm. And of course, we all know that there can be as much damage from winter storm as anything that has to do with a sort of a tropical or a flooding storm.
The world's becoming a smaller place, so when they report some of the hurricanes in the U.S. and you wait a day in Toronto, a day or a couple of days, and it all comes through, it's a high wind event in Toronto days later. But it's kind of interesting when you're watching on the news and then it strikes your life and you kind of say, wow, it's real. And I just, anecdotally, myself, I think absolutely more and more you're seeing that, and these storms become overlapping, and they dial through the hurricane names. It's almost like they have to come up with a second batch of names. They exhaust all the alphabet and then have to come back around again. It's crazy that storms are overlapping like that. So your take, it's not it's equally summer, winter. It's not Canada's not more susceptible to summer storm activity versus winter.
I would say, without, it's hard to make a broad generalization, but I think we've got climate change related issues in all seasons now. I think that's the difference. And the one thing, of course, I haven't mentioned is extreme heat spells. And we're seeing this for the first time in Canada. We never had these kind of ideas of cities as hot boxes. And there's no question that, especially for the vulnerable children, people with asthma, older people, that we're having negative outcomes, health outcomes from that as well now. And that's going to increase. So that's another summer event that's not wildfire, but can be equally devastating for a certain part of the vulnerable population.
A question here from one of our members who's kind of a futurist. What should our industry strategy be, knowing that sea levels might rise significantly in the next number of decades and entire cities might become uninsurable? So I think in people's minds, New Orleans is playing with fate, just being below sea level, just a matter of time. But we're now finding there's other areas of Canada that you're now worried about being uninsurable. Is that what's your take on that? What should the strategy be going forward as an industry? Because a lot of our risk managers out there are just, what can I do? What can our company do? What can we do to lessen the hit? So there's no question it's a huge issue, I think, for the industry and a huge issue for many people. Just to give you a sense of, it's estimated that 800 million people live within sort of half a meter of sea level. Wow. 800 million people. So we already have what they call climate refugees from all the low-lying islands now moving, but we're having issues ourselves in Canada now, as we know. And certainly there are going to be greater amounts of Canada as the years come that become basically uninhabitable. Generally what the scientists say is that there are three things that maybe insurance companies should think about in terms of responses. The first, in terms of thinking about sea level rising, the first is really engineering projects to keep the water out. And that includes things like levees and building new kinds of retaining walls that are much higher and much more structurally sound than they were previously. The second is what they call nature-based defenses, which are really this idea of building berms and other things that are really trying to minimize encroachment of whether it's fresh water or salt water into them. And then the third is, as you've referred to, as sort of peaceful-based strategies. Are we in a new era? And I think we are, where some low-lying lands are just not going to be available to be developed, and people that are already living there, I think, are going to have to move. And we've seen some of this with the flooding in Ontario in the past year, where well-intentioned government policies to buy people's houses are really buying them at the post-flood valuation rate, as opposed to their pre-flood valuation rate. And so people are left losing hundreds of thousands of dollars that they may be their entire retirement savings or their home equity investment, and yet those houses have become, in some parts of Ontario, uninhabitable now and really not salvageable. So do you think years ago in Manitoba, they built Duff's Ditch, the big spillway around to protect Winnipeg? Have we lost that opportunity with sprawl, that just those mega projects can't be undertaken now to combat climate change, flooding like that? That was a big project back in the, I believe, the 50s, and it saved Winnipeg 4 or 5 times.
Well, there was one in Toronto, very big one, the flood ones in 1954 in Toronto.
Okay.
So I remember often going to see them as a young person, and my parents telling me about they were opposed to hurricane. I think there's still a huge amount of potential for big infrastructure projects, and I think if one can sort out the not expropriation of houses, but fair compensation for houses that are now in uninhabitable areas, then I think the private sector, including the insurance sector, could partner with the government and think about what we can do to really engineer new ways in which that we're going to minimize sort of the damage and insurance claims over the long term. And you see a lot of this in the big sort of the reinsurance companies like Swiss Re. They're spending a lot of money on doing partnering and infrastructure, a lot in Europe especially, but not only in Europe, in the US and other countries. And they really have seen that this is the best preventive measure. It's good. It's going to be good investment dollars and good investment strategy, but also that it's going to control some of the harmful outcomes of catastrophic events.
So who's going to get it first? Are insurers out there probably wondering what areas of Canada are most susceptible in terms of being uninsurable or the water levels rising? Who's going to get it first? East Coast, West Coast?
It's a good question. I think I don't think you can say who's first, but I will say there are lots of low-lying parts of Eastern Canada, and I don't just mean the ocean coast. I mean all along the St. Lawrence River and all the way up into Ontario, Lake Ontario, etc. I think they're definitely high risk. I think that although Calgary's taken a lot of steps to prevent things, there's still high risk there. So it depends on the region of the country. And of course, one of the things we don't know is we can't predict. I mean, the IPCC says we can predict the severity and the intensity, but we can't predict with any certainty where they're going to be. And so none of us can afford not to take some preventive measures. But there's no question that different parts of the country, like in wildfires, BC and Alberta are the most vulnerable for sure. But there have been wildfires a lot in Ontario in the past 2 years, and so they're not immune from these issues either.
Okay. I talked earlier, and I'm remiss, it didn't mention this. Let's go back. Talking about emerging risks over the next 1 to 3 years. When we first asked this, it was industry competition, technological change, and cybersecurity were the top 3 issues, and climate change was fourth, a bit of a different or a distant fourth. Now, in 2019, in the next 3 years, they say number 1 is cybersecurity. So I think they're thinking with the pocketbooks there and immediate catastrophe. But climate change is now a solid number 2. Technological change and government regulation. So does the industry have it right? Do you think in terms of that's a pretty meteoric rise from fourth to second top of mind in short-term issues for our industry?
I think they have it pretty correct. I might put cybersecurity risk and climate risk together. I think they're both incredibly significant. But there's no question that cybersecurity is something, I know being on the Assurance board, this is something we spent a lot of time talking about as well. There's just lots of challenges and really, protecting just the entire infrastructure and everything in the operation of insurance companies. But climate is really, I think, on the horizon in a way in which it wasn't previously. And I think these acute events speak to that. But the other part of this puzzle is not just the acute events, it's what they call the chronic events. So that we're going to have sustained extreme heats. We're going to have sustained rainfall that's not a hurricane, but it's just pummeling areas. I can speak to this. It seems like that's been most of the fall in British Columbia. And I think that's why it's also rising, is because we're talking about not just the acute events, but also really systemic changes.
We asked long-term issues back in 2017 when we first asked this. Technological change was number 1 in terms of being a 10-year issue, industry competition and climate change. And so climate change is now, in the most recent results, number 2, right behind technological change. So I think the industry is very concerned about autonomous vehicles and technology and smart homes and all of that. But also climate change is really, I think, is being driven, reports you're seeing in the media, top of mind. So for our members, I think they're pretty spot on in terms of, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes the next time we do our survey. But again, that's available on our website, ERM Benchmark Survey Report, and of course you're going to see that later on. So let's go on to question number 4, a pocketbook issue. Do directors of insurance companies have a fiduciary obligation to address climate change? So your background, you come from the area of finance as well. What is, from a legal perspective, what's on the line for directors of insurance companies related to climate change?
So first of all, the law is very, very clear that directors and officers are to act in the best interests of the company. I think no one in Canada would doubt that. We don't come from what they call a shareholder primacy perspective legally in Canada, which is the US law. The Supreme Court of Canada and all of our statutes have been really clear on that. And so I know that that listeners have various statutes under which they're incorporated, but just to give you an example, the Insurance Companies Act, Section 166, says every director and officer in exercising the powers of a director and officer in discharging their duties must act honestly in good faith. I have no doubt you're all doing that, with a view to the best interest of the company, and here's the rub, and exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably person would exercise in comparable circumstances. And the Supreme Court has said that that means you have to act not only in the best interest of the corporation, but the best interest of the company as a good corporate citizen. Mm-hmm. So that was a move a few years ago away from what people had thought about previously. So there's a growing consensus, I think, in the legal community that that means that there is a fiduciary obligation to consider climate change quite seriously. There are different thresholds, of course. If a company considers it, just generally, not talking about the insurance sector, and it's not material, then they have considered it. They may have fulfilled their fiduciary obligations. I think for the insurance sector, it has to be on everybody's, it has to be material for just about everybody, and not just the P&C side, I would say on the life side as well. So the question is, what does that mean for directors and officers? And that means basically they have a fiduciary obligation to put their minds to the issue of climate change, to think about whether there is a strategy in place to manage those risks for the business over the short, medium, and long term, to actually have a plan, to have either the board itself or a board committee, the risk committee, the audit committee, who is actually trying to figure out the metrics of all this and try and make meaningful decisions. Clear assignment of responsibilities to senior management, whether there's a reporting mechanism up. All of these things are sort of hallmarks of exercise of fiduciary obligation. And when you look at, we don't have any direct case law on climate change fiduciary obligation yet in Canada. But when you look at where directors and officers have been found personally liable on environmental issues, it's the failure to have these checks and balances and the failure to govern, essentially, that gets them in trouble.
That leaves them exposed.
So inaction is the absolute worst thing. Having said that, the Supreme Court's also been really clear that if boards are making a determination in the face of imperfect information, which is, so I think what we would have to say about climate change, that's fine if they're making it and getting good advice and making it on the basis of the best information available, that they're not going to, in hindsight, find them liable. And they're not going to, in hindsight, say the company was irresponsible. So this notion of the deference to business judgment really hinges on make sure you've put your minds to it, make sure you've actually managed the risk, make your best decisions, and go forward from that. I will say that for those of you that might be interested, and if I can just give one tiny plug for one of my initiatives, is that my colleague Cynthia Williams and I, she's also chair in business law at Osgoode Hall Law School here in Toronto. We have had funding from 3 foundations to do something we call the Canadian Climate Governance Experts Initiative. And we have actually found 52 people who are very senior people in their fields, executive director of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance, people in capital investors, CEOs, etc., who are going to give their time for free for 2 years to speak to boards of directors about how to be effective in their climate governance. And so they're committed to doing 3 board meetings a year. I can give you the information, which you can post somewhere. But the initiative's a 2-year initiative to say, for those companies that really haven't figured out, we're not telling you what to do, obviously, but we can give some guidance on what the best thing to do, how to get a board started. And then from there, they can take it from there. But we've got some insurance experts within that group. And so if your board of directors is interested, it's a free seminar session with the corporate board. And we tailor it by having the expert meet with the CEO in advance and figure out where the board of directors is at, and then tailor what we call our core slides to the interests of the company. And we just saw a gap. We saw a gap in governance that we thought we could make a contribution to. And we thought we might get 30 people to step up, but you can tell how important this is because a full 52 people have said they will give their time for free. Wow. I can't even imagine what the billable hours would be. I haven't tried to add that up.
Cha-ching, cha-ching.
But it says something, I think, about the commitment to public service in a way to make sure that private corporate boards of all sectors really have a chance to start the conversation and have what we call an in-camera discussion, so we don't publicize the companies, et cetera, all of that.
I think with that question, you've given people out there a new risk to worry about. We have used our Risk Officers Forum and our Enterprise Risk Management Survey to kind of tighten the gap in best practices between large companies and small companies. And we've really seen small companies very closely tailor larger companies with ERM strategies and procedures and approaches. And I think this one is struck a chord about directors' exposure, the liability concerns about having a plan in place to address climate change. So I think that we'll revisit that in future ERM surveys, but that's a good point to raise today.
So I can tell you that even though there's no litigation pending specifically in Canada, there are over 2,000 cases pending right now in the world, and which 3/4 in the United States.
Yes, they're so litigious there.
And they are so litigious, but it's just a matter of time.
Okay.
I think they'll come to Canada. And just really quickly tell you, their breach of fiduciary obligation, failure to disclose, which I know we're going to talk about, failure to disclose climate risks. And the really interesting thing, besides the litigation I told you about all the states' attorney general, is what they call attribution science now can actually chart your company and the emissions it's making by satellite and attribute your emissions and your failure to save energy, etc.
Wow.
There's a whole program out of Oxford University and satellites as we speak, monitoring and coming up with this. And because of that, the science has come so far now that it's bolstering these legal claims. And so that's why we're going to see a lot more in the future.
Just a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, our next question. Climate change liability has been raised as one of the risks that can impact insurers. How can insurers assess the risk, and what can they do to mitigate that?
So here again, I think the answer is not much different than the last question, in the sense that the big thing is trying to actually get some sense of what the risks are. The companies in Canada are the beneficiaries of many international reports now from some of the big accounting firms, some of the big insurance companies, reinsurance companies in particular, have done a lot of studies about how to assess risk. As I said, there are, as we're getting some judgments in other jurisdictions, we have a much clearer sense of the kinds of ways and strategies that one should put one's mind to. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I think we're going to talk about in a few minutes, has been really helpful in providing some guidance about how one can assess risks and really put it in some form that is manageable by insurance companies.
Okay, okay. Can you talk about the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and what its impact will be on insurance companies in Canada? That's a question straight from one of our viewers. Thank you out there.
So I'm going to call that Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures the TCFD for short. And what will its impact be on insurance companies? So for those of you that may not be familiar with it, the task force was set up by the G20 countries. It asked the Financial Stability Board to really pull together a group of very senior CEOs, insurance CEOs, accountants, banking officials, etc., to think about how to develop a framework that would address climate change and disclosure. And it had massive deliberations. It rendered its final recommendations in 2018. And it's really been embraced internationally and in this country as the way forward for thinking about how to identify and then manage climate-related risks. So the framework has sort of four broad things that it focuses on: governance, strategy, risk management, and what it calls metrics and targets. It basically comes down on the side of saying that organizations, including financial institutions and insurers, should provide information specific to the sort of potential impact, as best they can, to climate-related risks and opportunities right in their financial statements. So as you probably know, many companies have separate sustainability reports that are unrelated to their financials. A lot of investors complain that there's no comparability year over year, and nor is there comparability from one company to the next. And so this idea of how do we effectively embed them in the financials and in the notes to the financials, I think is the next big thing that's going to happen. All of the major accounting firms and many of the major insurance companies in Canada have now embraced the TCFD recommendations. The federal government, in its most recent budget, said that we need to start moving towards TCFD on an incremental basis. And the Canadian securities regulators have now embraced the idea. So I think it's coming. It's been a bit slower here than in other jurisdictions. So I just maybe talk for a few minutes about what each of these components means specifically for insurance companies. So the first is risk management. And what the TCFD basically said was that insurance companies should describe the processes for identifying and assessing climate-related risks on insurance and reinsurance portfolios, and looking at it basically by business type, geography, product segments, etc., and looking at this notion of what are the physical risks arising from increasing intensity and frequency, and also the transition risks, which have to do with things like policy change, which we know has swung a little bit in various provinces over the last year, to put it nicely.
And the last week.
And the last week. And certainly there are other transition risks as well, not just policy risks. So it's this idea that, as certain assets are declining in value and others are going up, to try and get some handle on that in terms of what it means for the insurance company as a business itself. It also recommends that companies start to identify what they call, key tools or key instruments that they're using. What risk models are they trying to develop? And how are they trying to manage the climate-related risks? And then basically, what are the range of climate-related events that a particular company is already insuring for, and therefore presents risks for some of the earlier points I made about pricing uncertainty, etc. Then the second piece is the governance piece. And here, basically what the TCFD recommended, and I will say that none of this is all very public information, and when you go on the website for the TCFD and the final recommendations, you can actually navigate and click on specifically insurance companies, and then some of these sub-things come up and have very, very detailed advice for insurance companies. So they've done it by major sectors, and the information on insurance companies is really clear and really helpful. So in the governance, in describing the board's oversight of climate-related issues, they're suggesting that insurance companies should consider the processes and frequency by which the board or its audit or risk committees are informed about the issues. In other words, they need to be sort of at the top of the board's agenda, maybe not every board meeting, but frequently. Whether they're using an assessment of what the climate risk is and thinking about strategic planning, budget planning, business plans, all of the kinds of ways in which boards exercise oversight, how the board is monitoring against goals and targets in terms of accountability by senior managers up to the board, so open lines of communication, and that certainly goes back to where there have been liability issues in the past and environmental issues. And, looking at possibly attaching remuneration for reaching particular goals. One of the interesting things, not an insurance company, but the Caisse de dépôt et placement, it's sort of an institutional investor out of Quebec. It's one of our largest in the country. They now peg their compensation of portfolio managers to reducing their carbon investments and increasing their renewables investments. And they're the first that I know of in this country who have said this is the way to do it, is that we're saying portfolio managers, we're serious about this. And I think some reinsurance companies internationally have started doing that. And so I think that's probably another sort of governance issue that's coming forward. Strategy, not to make too long an answer on this one, but basically strategy is what you'd all suspect, and that is that we need to be very strategic in investigating what the risks might be and assessing how that impacts on pricing models, on whether or not premiums are going to be sufficient, how we're going to price in a way in which people are still going to buy insurance and we're not going to have catastrophes in terms of harms being caused to individuals, policyholders, because they've been inappropriately insured. But it also means basically thinking about, and as investors, and we've got some insurance companies that are very large investors, is thinking about some shift sooner than later in renewables, carbon sequestration, different ways in which we're going to enhance carbon sinks. So thinking ahead about not just the risks, but really the opportunities. And I do think there are opportunities that we really haven't capitalized on in this country. And then finally is this notion of disclosure. And I think this is the hardest one. Disclosure is not hard, but to think about what metrics and targets might be, I think is a challenge. I think it's a challenge for a lot of companies. And so when we hear about disclosing your internal carbon emissions and calculating the different kinds, but how do we sort of systematize that in a way that's meaningful for others who might want to invest in insurance companies. I will say, just by way of ending on those four things, is that the TCFD has now published what they call a technical supplement to guide issuers on both scenarios disclosure and other kinds of disclosures. And it's done a review of a bunch of insurance companies in Canada and elsewhere. And what it's found is that companies are actually pretty good on the risk assessment. They're pretty well lacking on the governance oversight. And so this is still a real big challenge in Canada.
Just in terms of regular information flowing to the board of directors.
Right. And the board really being high on their list of, we should be thinking about this business plan, strategic planning. And again, a board might decide, not necessarily an insurance board, but might decide it's not material. But once they put their mind to it and made that informed calculation, they should be fine on governance. But I think most insurance companies, it has to be an important issue.
We have a compensation fund on behalf of the industry. I think it's about $56 million to provide short-term liquidity to deal with the next industry insolvency, and our funds are managed professionally, and our fund manager we meet with semi-annually, talking about how things are going, and that is, it's not only the return on the dollar, but we're talking about sustainable investments. That factors into the investments they're making, so it's very interesting. I'm sure companies out there can relate to exactly that. Our next question. Do you have ideas about what kind of scenario testing insurers should conduct for climate change with a holistic view of this risk area?
If I knew the answer to that, I would be doing very well. So I can't answer that directly, but what I can say is I have been persuaded that scenario testing is the way to go. And I say that not just because the TCFD has become a very strong supporter of that, but I know that in my own consideration on the life insurance side is that when one starts testing various scenarios, it really crystallizes what the downside risks and the upside opportunities are. And the TCFD talks about the fact that the key to scenario testing is sort of testing at what they call a low emission scenario. In other words, if we get our public policy together, and as we meet our international commitments essentially under the Paris COP21 agreement, what does that look like for the industry? But then if we don't get our act together as a country, what does a 2-degree scenario look like? What does a 3-degree scenario look like? And these are very different scenarios, and I think they do need to be considered.
And then I guess it's hazard by hazard, flooding versus storm activity versus wildfire, and on for every temperature change.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And not only is it sort of at different temperature ranges, but this idea of sort of immediate or short-term, medium and long-term, I think are important for scenario development. But there's two things I do want to say that will be of assistance to people out there if they're unfamiliar with them. The first is that this year, the TCFD launched what they call their Knowledge Hub. And I think you could find this very easily online by just searching TCFD Knowledge Hub. And what it has done is it has put in place over 400 tools and resources on how to start thinking about scenario testing and how to start designing that. So I think that's going to be very helpful for the insurance sector. And the second thing is also started, announced this year. So they haven't done it yet, but the UN EP Finance Initiative has sort of created a partnership of 16 of the largest insurers in the world. And basically what they represent about $5 trillion in assets under management. And they are going to, they've committed to developing a new generation of scenario testing and risk assessment tools. So what they're aiming for is they're saying we're willing to put in resources to try and create some consistency in scenario testing, specifically geared to the insurance sector. And so stay tuned. I mean, this is a very recent initiative. It might have been very late last year it was announced. It's not even a year old. But I do think that will be one of the keys. If the sector itself develops the scenario tools in a sort of a language that speaks to everyone who's listening today, that will be a big leap forward in the helpfulness, I think, of scenario testing. So they're saying what they're going to do is making use of the latest climate science, that they're going to have advanced forward-looking climate scenarios available, which they'll consider essential to the core business of insurance. And they're going to think about it right across from the physical risks to the transition risks and create basically a kind of a toolkit for all insurance companies. So I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I'm wishing it a lot of sort of goodwill because I think that will really help us.
Okay. Another question. What are positive things the industry is doing to combat climate change? And what are things that insurers should be doing more of to get us closer to what was agreed to in the Paris Agreement you just talked about? So what's working well for the industry right now?
So I think initiatives like the one I've just mentioned is pretty important. I think the industry was very involved in the TCFD, which is why it looks so responsible, I think, in terms of being industry user-friendly. I think the biggest thing the industry could do is, as investors, that they could really shift the trajectory of Canada. So it's, we have a challenge in this country because, of course, the fossil fuel industry is a substantial part of our GDP. It's about 15%. It's huge. And you compare it to the insurance sector is, 2%, I think. And so a lot of companies are invested heavily and have been for many years and been beneficiaries of that. But really, if we're going to have a meaningful change, everybody has to put their mind to how to move those companies to lower carbon footprints, and then also how to invest in other kinds of energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, natural carbon sinks. And I think the investment power of insurance companies is very significant in this. And really, if we're proactive in the sense of thinking about partnering on, for example, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is supposed to be going to invest $35 billion, partnering with the private sector. They've done their first 5 projects. It's a drop in the bucket. There's a lot of potential there for public-private partnerships to think about. So I think the industry has started in that, and I think it could do a lot more and be very proactive and really leaders in this. I think there's the potential there.
You'd like to think that at the border, the Canada-U.S. border, the issue doesn't stop there. Are you finding are we approaching it the same way as insurers in the States? Is Canada's approach a little bit different? Things we're doing here versus the approach down in the U.S.? What's your?
My sense is there's a big global conversation, and that there's a lot of alignment of the private sector in Canada and the U.S. and other countries. I think the uncertainty is for the companies that just want to wait to react to public policy. That's a problem because in the US, of course, it has unwound its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Although I think something like 20 or 30 states have now gone ahead and said they're going to comply with the Paris Agreement, even though the federal government says it's not going to. Yeah. So I think for companies that are just reacting to public policy, there may be a different conversation. But we've also had our challenges in Canada. We've had a pan-Canadian plan. We've had provinces pull out of it. We've had carbon pricing disputes, I guess. And, to be very clear, the carbon pricing legislation, although I know it's not a direct question, is really the federal government's attempt to set a minimum standard. So any province can meet it or do whatever they want as long as it's more. And so it's really an invitation to provinces to do more, but at least to set a baseline for us. And that baseline won't get us to our Paris commitments, frankly. I mean, everybody agrees with that. So I'd like to think it's not that big a difference. I think where it's more problematic is where you have a lot of assets invested in other jurisdictions that maybe are in different places. So how do I put this? I mean, I think that if you are a Canadian company with a lot of assets in the United States, there's some questions about what that means for treatment of stranded assets if that happens. There may be large investments in Asia. And so the question is around climate issues, what will that mean I worry more about Canadian companies where the assets are located elsewhere, or Canadian subsidiaries, frankly, where the parent is located elsewhere, and there might be a disconnect between what we see as probably best policy or governance policy or best governance and risk management. And that's where we might see some differences. But the truth is, for the big insurers, they're pretty aligned now. They really see this as a challenge that they have really grasped. And they're spending a lot of time thinking about it.
I think politically you may see some changes down in the States in the next term. So that may change the whole trajectory of where this goes. But we won't get into politics. But question number 9. What's the role of insurers in mitigating risks from climate change? And with your reach into the insurance community, what would you suggest as practical strategies to implement in order to mitigate risks arising from climate change? It's all about risk mitigation.
Yeah, I think good governance is the most effective thing to mitigate risk. My own view is that when you have effective governance at the top, and at the top I mean not only the board of directors, but the CEO, CFO, chief operating officer, that really will be the best strategy. And I think the difference between now and 5 years ago is that all of these tools were not available before. Whether it's having an climate expert come in and speak to your board to get you started, whether it's accessing all of the tools that have been developed by a very responsible set of participants, the 36 sort of senior members that participated in the TCFD. I think the second thing is I think we need to sort of narrow the insurance gap, if I can call it that, in terms of natural disasters or catastrophes. I think that we still have lots of issues in this country around national policy, national backstops, around flooding policy, and other kinds of things that are generated directly out of climate change. And I do appreciate we have other risks too. Cybersecurity is one, earthquake risks for sure is another one. You can't really blame that on climate change. Right. But we could do better in both the interface of government policy and insurance company coverage, and thinking about policyholders sort of as a constituency we care about. We need to think about that. We need to think about solvency risk, frankly, of insurers that maybe aren't as able or capable of adjusting to some of these risks. And that's not just P&C, it's on life, it's on other sides as well. Mm-hmm. I do think the other thing we need to do is we really need to think about the technology available and where it's rapidly developing. So there's a gap in Canada, and you just need to go to any investor conference in this country. There's a gap between the new technologies that are being developed, some amazing technologies, whether it's biofuel or energy efficient measures, retrofitting of buildings, and the scaling up of investment. And so one of the things that really is not only a good investment opportunity and strategy, an upside strategy, but it's also a preventive mechanism. It's an adaptation mechanism in the sense that if we can scale up the capital for this, and we've had an expert panel on sustainable finance and made a series of recommendations, if we can scale up the capital, then we might prevent a lot of the damage that could happen that would then create financial distress for the insurers, or it certainly prevent stress to policyholders who can no longer afford the premiums. A number of Canadian insurance companies are now signatories to the UN Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and that's really trying to think about how you work with governments, to think about these national frameworks, how you work with private partners, how you look beyond your own proprietary business interests to say, because of the systemic challenge, we need to actually get past that and have conversations with sectors of the economy with whom we perhaps don't always agree, and in new and meaningful ways, I think. And so I think that is important. You may have heard of the Climate Wise Network. You may not have, but you may have. And that's 27 leading insurers and reinsurers that are committed to reducing the impact of climate change on society. So this is a commitment to say, beyond our own businesses, we need to think about what our contribution is to mitigating the climate impact. And really, for the global insurers, this is a massive challenge because, of course, as much as we have big challenges in this country, we're not suffering the effects nearly as much as many other parts of the world. Having said that, and you made reference earlier to the fact that we're small contributors to the global carbon footprint. And that is true, but it's also true on a per capita basis. We have one of the highest carbon footprints in the world. And also, which is something that people don't know and is fairly uncontested, is that the mid-range of the country, we all know about the Arctic ice melting rapidly, but the mid-range of the country, we're warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And so we have specific made in Canada challenges, if I can call them that. And then the final thing I guess I'd mention on this question is there was a report in June of this year from the Sustainable Insurance Forum. It was a survey of sort of 1,200 firms about where there's leadership, and I really commend the report. It really just tried to reflect on where the sector is now and what kind of leadership I think would be helpful going forward. And so you have these organizations that are putting some time and resources in that are very specifically focused on the insurance sector. And they didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. So it's a huge amount of information that companies can access, even if they don't have huge internal resources to sort of take on these projects. And I do think that they're trying to systematize things and develop tools, if I can call them that, to help all insurance companies, not just the big players.
You're giving me food for thought here. Our Risk Management Advisory Committee oversees the issues that we talk about at the forum and in our Emerging Risks webinars, and we're meeting in a week's time to talk about the plan for next year. And so corporate governance and scenario testing as it relates to climate change are, I've made notes here, and I'll raise them in a week's time because I think those are good sessions. We could have an in-face meeting and talk about tackling climate change, and it's a broad topic, but if you can give us some very discrete things to talk about, like those, like corporate governance, information flowing to the board and their exposure and liability, big concern for members. So we'll pursue that. Okay, next question. What investment strategies do you consider to be effective strategies to mitigate transition risk?
Well, I really probably have answered this already. I mean, it does depend on the business, certainly. But the smart money is really investing in infrastructure and investing in sort of the low carbon technologies. I would say that is where investors are going. And without speaking directly to the insurance sector, I spent a lot of time with mining companies and other companies like that who have sizable carbon footprint. And I say, well, your plan is great. And they say, it's investors pushing us. So institutional investors are shifting their money, lots of commitments to shift their money. And so if we want to think about where the insurance sector should go, it's really looking at those trends. And there's certainly lots of information out there about that. And obviously, depending on the region you're operating in, whether it's national or regional, there may be different kinds of things that make a lot of sense for the business. But it's got to be with a view to the future as much as it is. We don't want too much hindsight guessing. We just want to think about where are there investment opportunities. How do you do that in a way that doesn't tank our economy by doing it too rapidly?
I think we probably argued the transition. Is it 20 years? Is it 40? Is it 60? Like, when do we start adopting these new technologies, these cleaner technologies, get out of the oil and gas? It's a lot of people say, sure, I'd love to be doing that. I'd love to be driving, but you can't have electric planes. We'll still get around by plane travel. Maybe you can reduce, bank your meetings before you take that travel opportunity. But I think everyone's just arguing, like, sure, we'd love to scale back, but what's responsible, what's realistic?
Right.
This transition, realistically, how long do you think the transition period is?
Well, I think it's got to start now, but I think it's going to take a while. And are we going to have it done in 10 years? No.
No.
We have it done in 20 years, hopefully. We don't have much longer than that without really talking about really a radically different kind of lay of the land, if I can call it that. Mm-hmm. But all of these things, think about it. All of these things, they start from small things and they go to bigger things. So there's no reason. The technology is great. I mean, I'm talking to people across Canada. Why we're all flying all the time for meetings when there could be just as good sort of communications of board meetings, et cetera, for national companies. I mean, it's everything from as small of that as to just thinking twice about our carbon footprint. But electric planes are a long way off, but they're testing all sorts of biofuels now. There are planes in the air with biofuels. They're just not certified yet for passenger safety, mm-hmm. But they're around the corner. I mean, make no mistake, it'll look very different. It's interesting because one study out of the US, I think it's Columbia University, might be Cambridge though, that basically says they've looked at the S&P Fortune 500 companies, and the average lifespan used to be about 67 years, and it is now 15 years. And they predict that in 10 years, it'll be a whole different complexion of who's there. And when you think about that, that is saying in 10 years, there's a radical shift company in who will be the profitable companies and which companies will decline if they're not adapting. And lots of companies will adapt, so I have no doubt about that. It's not as if we're going to lose all of our major industries. We won't. But the question is, how do you start now in a meaningful way? And then how do you build what's the short term, what's the medium term, and what is the long-term strategy? I'm a big believer there's as many opportunities as there are risks, but they're both huge. but we're not there yet.
We can't even in Toronto agree on the next mile of subway tracks. So I can playing that out in my head as you were talking here. I was just thinking, oh my God, we've got some work to do. While Canada is one of the most impacted countries due to climate change, we have a much lower carbon footprint than other countries, the US, China, etc. What should Canada do to help reduce global climate emissions, political action, risk mitigation? What are things we can do when we're sitting looking at the world and saying, who's going to be first?
It's a big challenge. I mean, I think, as I've said already, I think we have our own obligations as a country. But, there are a lot of insurance companies in Canada, some of the bigger ones especially, who are invested all over the world. And I do think when we're talking about globally, I think there's a potential to influence companies in other parts of the world to do their share, and possibilities to work in partnership with government and business together to figure out the strategy. And some of the really big AXA, Swiss Re, et cetera, are doing a lot of this work now. For many businesses, and this isn't just insurance, a lot of their supply inputs are coming from these countries. And so if they're going to crash, so to speak, from all of these acute events, then it's going to affect many, many sectors of the Canadian economy because they haven't supported or helped deal with some preventive things in the countries in which they source, everything from raw materials to whatever the inputs are. So I do think it's an important issue. I think we've been a pretty good country in sort of looking beyond our borders. I think we do better than the United States, for example, on this. But it's a big challenge. And I think when we've got parts of our population, particularly policyholders who are just worrying about the flooding and the wildfires, et cetera, how many resources we dedicate as a country to other nations, I think is a live issue. I'll be quite honest. But having said that, part of the Paris Agreement is that each country is going to make a contribution to developing countries to assist them. So then the question becomes, how do we best do that? And I think one of the ways we best do that is maybe partner with countries in terms of investment dollars. Not to recoup all the profits, not to sort of scoop everything away from them, but to engage in a sort of a true partnership that puts investment dollars in, but says we're doing this because we also see their benefits in the long term to Canada from supply inputs, et cetera. But it's definitely a challenge. There's no question about that. I recently became aware of another group of insurers that's acting. And this is an initiative that was launched in 2017. I probably pronounced it incorrectly, but it's resilience. So it's this idea of insure and resilience as one word. And it's a global partnership for climate and risk disaster finance and insurance solutions. And so the G20 got together with what they call the V20, and the V20 are the finance ministers from 20 vulnerable countries, and then also 65 insurance companies. And they got together to say, what can we do collectively to think about the global commitments, to say that we are willing to reach beyond our borders and talk about some of these issues. And so it really is trying to think about timely disaster relief, to think about sort of structures around what should national programs look like in those jurisdictions, what support do they or don't they need from the International Monetary Fund and other countries. But it's an interesting initiative, and it's also trying to develop for countries that have less sophisticated challenges, because we all know that even though they're feeling the most devastating consequences, they're also the least contributors to global warming in many jurisdictions. China is a different case, but many of these countries aren't large carbon emitters, but they're feeling the effects of this. And so it's really to think about how they can do more simplistic scenario assessment, risk assessment, et cetera, and to give them some tools there. So it's an interesting initiative, and I'm very proud of the fact that there are 65 insurance companies involved.
And that's interesting that they're actually targeting the most vulnerable, the lowest, because by shoring up their capabilities, everybody runs as a pack, and you're more likely to gain some traction. This is an issue that the last week has been all about politics in Canada. What's the government's role or current initiatives in helping the insurance industry deal with catastrophe caused by climate change? So I think right now is a very sensitive time in Canada with national unity. We went through a very bitter federal election campaign, And climate change is on the agenda, definitely. And right now, with the way the votes shook out, there's some sensitivity about certain regions of the country not being heard from. And so it's going to challenge the government's role going forward, trying to come up with a balanced program and roll this out right across Canada. So what's the role, and what's your advice in terms of the government's role in tackling climate change, catastrophes caused by climate change? What's the best advice you can give them right now, coming fresh off
the election? Well, I think the election really showed that we are a divided country.
Yes.
And we are also a country with a lot of regional interests. And so that's the reality. And I think my advice to government would be that there has to be a way forward where there's genuine dialogue and serious policy work done. And I think the private sector, including the insurance sector, could have a really meaningful role in this. There's no question it's going to have to be a different kind of dialogue now. And I say that from perspectives like clearly the message from Quebec was no Eastern Pipeline, and very strong messages, and the message from the prairie provinces was quite a different message. But I think we can't be paralyzed is the bottom line. And so I think that there's a role for government. Now, having said that, there's sort of a lot of facets to that. The infrastructure bank, the $35 billion I talked about, I think it's not paying maybe enough attention to climate. I think it could be, I think $5 billion was set aside specifically for climate related. I don't think that's enough. Mm-hmm. The second is, of course, that there's been talk about, sort of a national flood kind of catastrophe strategy. Sort of a better backstop for insurance, the insurance gap. I think that has been endorsed by the previous federal government, which is at least at this moment the current federal government, but it needs to move forward. So agreement in principle isn't enough, but to work with the insurance sector to say how is this going to play out? If you have major flooding, how are we bridging the gap for all the harm? How do we protect insurance so it's still affordable for people? So on that sort of front, I think that's important. I think that, I know that in the last few years, most of the insurers have moved to sort of offer flood protection, but we still have quite a gap in who gets insurance. A lot of people maybe think they have flooding insurance and they don't, or they certainly don't have enough. And so part of it's a public information strategy. I think the government should have a role in sort of getting information out to people about what isn't covered, what isn't covered, frankly, if an insurer starts to have financial distress, what is not covered under, PASIC's sort of backstop facility and the government's backstop facility over PASIC. So I think that that's important. So it's this idea of a sort of a public-private partnership that actually develops strategies around the most catastrophic kind of events. And I think that's the only way insurance is probably going to stay affordable, and we're going to make sure that companies stay viable. And I don't say that lightly because, nobody wants sort of bailouts, so to speak. But there have been lots of strategies in the banking sector, which are like bail-ins, mm-hmm. and lots of thinking about how you do conversion of debt to equity, et cetera. I think there are a lot of tools there that the government could take some responsibility in developing for the insurance sector as well. It's interesting, federally, for the companies that are regulated by the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions, they, of course, have now said, the OFSP has now said that climate change is a key solvency risk for all the companies that it's supervising. For the first time in the last few months, it has said that we need you to do a solvency assessment based on this. We're going to start asking you to report all the time on climate-related things. So I think it's seeing itself as having a much more active oversight role than it had previously. It's acknowledged that. It also says, though, that most companies they're sufficiently geographically diversified right now, and they're sufficiently have reinsurance protection that they're fine. But it worries about as the cost of reinsurance goes up, or as we have more catastrophes, whether things become uninsurable, is that could create a solvency risk. So it sees its role very fundamentally. And similarly, the Bank of Canada has now said that it will be taking climate change as a major sort of risk to the financial system in Canada. And so these are just developments within the last 3 months. These are very new. Well, OSFI was February, but all this year, sort of a major step forward. And so I do think government sees it has a role. And I think it hasn't completely put its mind to where it is. And my own view is I wish we would stop litigating it and start working on it. And so I'm hopeful that when the Supreme Court of Canada settles the two references from the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan and the Court of Appeal in Ontario, it will put that to rest, and then all of those resources can be directed at sort of direct government activity.
You hit on something. A colleague here in the office of mine, Grant Kelly, in the spring, produced a paper, part of our Why Insurers Fail. We do a study each year on past failures of insurance companies, and we also do trends and issues in the industry. And so Grant looked at what's the tipping point when, for the PASIC model, it falls to all the surviving companies to bail out when an insurance company becomes insolvent. The cost falls to all the other surviving companies in the industry. And the larger the catastrophes they deal with, the costs then to those other companies starts to snowball, and in turn there will hit a point where they will start to fail and the whole industry fails. So you're definitely in sync with concerns raised in the office here, and PASIC has had those discussions with IBC and with the Department of Finance. So let's hope that continues, and then we can resolve this issue. Do you find it more of a challenge dealing with climate change in a minority government situation? Do you really think in the next, however long this term lasts, we're going to see action? Is it much more of a challenge?
I think we will see some action. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, and we're too fresh off it, right? I mean, the Liberal minority has natural alliances on different issues around this. So I would say on the insurance sector and policyholder protection and maybe the backstop on flooding and all of those issues, it's going to align certainly with the NDP and the Greens, and possibly the Conservatives as well. I would think there'd be Conservative support for that kind of thing. On pipelines, it's going to be difficult and challenging. And the question is really where we put limited government money, whether it's infrastructure or renewables or whatever. And I think we're not there yet, as we aren't yet on carbon pricing. But I think we'll get there. So I think that I think what was nice to see in the election was, except for one party that didn't get any seats, there were really no deniers. There was no one who was saying this is not an important issue. There were differences certainly on how to deal with it and the amount of which government should intrude or not. There were definitely differences. Right. But I think
general acknowledgement of the problem.
This was the first election. There was general acknowledgement right across the board of the problem. And I think that will help this government in a way. It had a broad majority mandate, but now it's a pretty clear mandate from the electorate that the climate issues are up there.
The voters were always right. There was a party, a very minor party, that begged to differ, but that was addressed to no seats. So I think ultimately the voters are always correct. Another question, and I'm looking at time here, conscious of time, but another 5 minutes, so I'm just going to wrap this up. In your opinion, how will climate change impact the Canadian economy as a whole in the long term, over the next 10 years, beyond that?
I don't think that 10 years is the long term anymore, but 10 years, a lot can happen. I think that, and I've touched on some of these issues, I just think I have confidence that we will be a greener economy, certainly, and that insurers will have played a role in that. And so our economy will look different. It won't be as fossil fuel dependent. I do believe that. I think it will take us maybe 10 years, but I think we will be much less fossil fuel dependent. When you look at the highest carbon emitters once you get past oil and gas, so transportation's about, I think it's about, so oil and gas is about 24% of our carbon footprint, but construction's 15%, transportation is 24%. Yeah. You know, they're big, and there's huge potential right away in those sectors, and they know it. And so there's a lot being done right now, and so our economy will look a lot better. The question is, what we have, the fear I have, if I can call it that, is because our institutional investors invest globally, pension funds, the big private equity funds, et cetera. If we don't step up with sort of ramping up, they will go elsewhere. And, you know, they're looking a lot to Europe because there's so many green technologies there. And so what we need to do, the vision I would hope for 10 years from now, is that we have enough in place that the capital stays, a certain amount of it will stay home and stay in Canada, understanding that we have to do this as a country. But as global investors, you know, we appreciate pension funds in particular. They have to think long term. They have to think about intergenerational, producing intergenerational benefits for not only me, closer to retirement age, but for workers entering the workforce now. And so if we don't think about these strategies, they will put their money other places. But I like to be an optimist, and so I think that the more we talk about these issues and try to deal with some of the technical challenges, then we could be in very good shape in 10 years.
I think that, I know webinars like this, we could talk for probably 3 hours. We've run out of time, but probably a good point to conclude our discussion. I'm going to put a placeholder and reserve the right to invite you back in future to come back and let's revisit this discussion and hear new questions and feedback for our folks out there.
Can I just say thank you to the audience for the questions? I was sent the questions and I was asked, do you want to add anything? And I wrote back and said, these are great questions and I don't need to add anything.
That's terrific. Great to hear. And thank you very much, everybody, for your questions out there. Our next event is Risk Officers Forum meeting taking place next Monday. It happens to be the same day that OSFI holds its annual risk management seminar. We generally hold our forum meetings on a on a Thursday, but it's a Monday, and OSFI is calling the shots here. They do their morning webinars, their morning risk management meeting. We do our afternoon forum meeting. It works well. Everybody's in Toronto for that. Our keynote speaker for the forum meeting is Andrew Cartmel, President and CEO, board member of PASIC, and with the Saskatchewan Government Insurance. And he's going to talk about the CEO perspective on ERM. We're going to be looking at cannabis legalization 1 year in. We have an expert panel we've assembled. Mark Moore is coming in from the U.S. Highway Loss Data Institute. Pete Walker in town here, underwriter with Aviva Canada Inc., and Paul Field with the Old Republic Insurance Company of Canada are going to be joining us on a panel to talk about that. We're going to talk about the issues that OSFI talked about in the morning. We've pulled together an industry panel of Catherine Hyland from Swiss Re, Sonia Kundi from Aviva PLC, and Michelle Falcons from Heartland Farm Mutual Inc. It's an exciting agenda, and we hope you can join us for this meeting. I will be reissuing registration forms. They're in circulation, but I'll reissue that final call for people that want to attend that. Our guest today has been Dr. Janis Sarra, Professor of Law, Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC. Thank you very much for a very informative, entertaining, and enlightening talk. On behalf of viewers, I really appreciate your insight, your fresh perspective from a legal perspective on the issue of climate change. A copy of this webinar is going to be posted on the PASIC website. Watch for that shortly. I'll announce that to the industry. And webinar participants, you're going to be asked to complete a brief follow-up satisfaction survey. And we want your ideas on future topics and what you enjoyed about today's broadcast and opportunities. There were lots of things we talked about today and ways we can make this better in future and subject matter you want to see covered. I want to thank Mike and Jeff at EventStream for their technical support and expertise with today's broadcast. Well done, boys. This concludes today's webinar. We look forward to having you join us for future sessions. Thank you again for tuning us in, and goodbye for now.